Welcome to Cozy Jury. Tonight's story will test you. It's messy, it's complicated, and by the end, you will decide who's right and who's wrong. But before we begin, if you value what we're building here, hit like. Subscribe if you want more of this, but only if this is your kind of content. I'd rather earn it than beg for it. Drop a comment. Where are you right now and what time is it?
I love knowing who's out there deliberating with us. Now get comfortable. You're not just listening, you're the jury. The fire's burning. The case is open. Let's begin. Carmen Martinez found the business card on her hospital bedside table. Law offices, downtown Chicago. It shouldn't have been there. Her son Roberto hadn't visited yet.
The nurse had placed it there with a message scrawled on the back in unfamiliar handwriting. Won't make it today? Important client dinner. The card smelled faintly of expensive cologne, the kind Roberto started wearing after law school, the kind that cost more than what Carmen used to spend on groceries for a week. She picked it up with trembling fingers, the paper stock thick and embossed, professional, cold. Outside her hospital window, Chicago's skyline glittered in the late afternoon sun, towers of glass and steel reaching toward a sky that seemed impossibly far from the cramped apartment above her birria restaurant where she'd raised Roberto alone. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that particular frequency that makes hospital rooms feel like nowhere places, suspended between the world of the living and something else entirely. Carmen's left hip throbbed where she'd hit the pavement outside her restaurant 12 hours earlier, the bone bruised but mercifully not broken according to the X-rays. Her right wrist was wrapped, sprained from trying to catch herself. The IV in her arm pulled slightly when she moved, a cold trickle of saline reminding her that her body had finally given up, had finally said enough. The doctor had used words like exhaustion and malnutrition and dehydration. 72 years old, and she'd collapsed on West 18th Street in Pilsen, right there on the sidewalk in front of her own restaurant, the place she'd run for 43 years, where the smell of slow-cooked goat meat and toasted chilies had seeped into her hair and skin so deeply she couldn't remember what she smelled like before. The business card felt heavy in her hand. She read the message again. Important client dinner. Her brain kept trying to reject it, kept searching for alternative explanations. Maybe the nurse copied it wrong. Maybe Roberto said he'd come tomorrow and she misunderstood. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation for why her only child, the son she'd worked 70-hour weeks to put through college and law school, couldn't find 2 hours to visit his mother in the hospital after she'd been brought in by ambulance. Her thumb traced the embossed letters of his name. Roberto Martinez, Esquire. Partner, Hastings and Webb. The card was new, recently printed. She'd never seen it before. When had he made partner? Had he told her? She tried to remember the last real conversation they'd had. Not the brief phone calls where he sounded distracted, where she could hear keyboards clicking in the background, where he'd say he was busy and he'd call her back, and then he wouldn't. Carmen's hospital gown was thin, the kind that never quite covers everything, that leaves you feeling exposed and vulnerable. She pulled the blanket higher, even though the room was warm. A monitor beeped beside her bed, tracking her heartbeat in green peaks and valleys. Steady. Normal. Everything medically fine except she'd worked herself into the ground and her son couldn't be bothered to show up. That's what this was really about, wasn't it? The realization settled in her chest like something heavy and cold. This wasn't an accident. This was a choice. Roberto had chosen a client dinner over his mother lying in a hospital bed. He'd sent a business card instead of himself. The professionalism of it, the clean corporate excuse, somehow made it worse than if he'd just said he didn't care. She remembered finding him after school when he was 8, sitting on the curb outside their apartment crying because the other kids made fun of his second-hand clothes. She'd held him and promised that someday things would be different, that he'd have nice things, that she'd make sure he had opportunities she never had. She'd meant it. Every blister on her hands from stirring massive pots of consommé, every night she fell into bed too exhausted to shower, every birthday and holiday she spent in the restaurant instead of celebrating because there were customers to serve and rent to pay, she'd done it for him, so he could have those nice clothes, so he could go to good schools, so he could become something more than she'd been. Now, you might think you know exactly what happened here. Ungrateful son forgets his working-class mother after making it big, but it's not that simple, because this business card wasn't the end. It was the trigger for a war, a quiet war, fought in legal documents and property deeds and the cold mathematics of who owns what, but a war nonetheless. To render a fair verdict, you can't just look at the crime scene, you have to understand the motive, and the motive started years ago, in decisions Carmen made with love and hope that would eventually back her into a corner with no good options. What Carmen didn't know yet, lying in that hospital bed turning a business card over in her wrinkled hands, was that this betrayal went deeper than just a missed visit. Before this story ends, there will be lawyers and legal documents and a confrontation that will split opinion right down the middle. Half of you will call it justice, the other half will call it revenge. Some will say a mother has every right to protect herself. Others will say she went too far, that you can't put conditions on love, that family doesn't work like a business transaction. Was Carmen right to do what she did next? Hold that thought, because to understand why she made the choice she made, you need to know how they got here. Let's go back to the beginning, to the very first red flag that everyone missed. Carmen met Roberto's father, Miguel, at a church dance in Guadalajara when she was 19 years old. It was one of those sticky summer evenings where the heat doesn't break even after the sun goes down, where the air feels thick enough to swim through. The community center had opened its doors wide, trying to catch any hint of breeze. Miguel asked her to dance during a slow song, his hand warm and slightly sweaty against her waist, and she remembered thinking he had kind eyes, the kind of eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. They talked about small things, safe things, his job at the automotive plant, her work helping her mother sell tamales at the market. He made her laugh by doing impressions of his supervisor, a man who apparently took himself far too seriously. When he walked her home that night, he didn't try to kiss her, just asked if he could see her again. She said yes. They dated for 8 months before he proposed, traditional and proper, asking her father's permission first. Carmen's mother had been thrilled, already planning the wedding, talking about grandchildren. Miguel seemed stable, employed, respectable. He didn't drink excessively like some of the other young men in the neighborhood. He attended Mass regularly. He treated Carmen with a careful courtesy that felt like respect. Looking back, she realized she'd mistaken his quietness for depth, his reserve for mystery. Really, he was just absent, already half gone even when he was standing right in front of her. The wedding was modest, held at their parish church with a reception in her parents' backyard. Carmen wore her mother's altered wedding dress. Miguel wore a suit borrowed from his cousin. They ate carnitas and drank Jamaica water and danced until her feet hurt. She remembered feeling happy, genuinely happy, believing she was starting the life she was supposed to have. They moved into a small rental, 2 rooms and a shared bathroom down the hall. Miguel continued working at the plant. Carmen took in sewing, altering clothes for neighbors to bring in extra income. When she got pregnant 3 months after the wedding, Miguel seemed pleased in his distant way, patting her stomach awkwardly and saying he hoped for a son. Roberto was born on a Tuesday morning after 18 hours of labor that left Carmen exhausted and transformed. She'd never felt anything like it, that fierce, immediate love that made everything else in the world seem small and unimportant. Miguel visited the hospital briefly, looked at the baby through the nursery window, said he looked healthy, and then went back to work. Even then, Carmen told herself it was fine, that men handled emotions differently, that he was probably just nervous about being a father. She created explanations, built narratives that made his absence make sense, because the alternative, that he simply didn't care very much, was too painful to accept. Life settled into a routine. Carmen stayed home with Roberto those first years, living on Miguel's paycheck and the money she made, taking in sewing. Miguel worked, came home, ate dinner, watched television, went to bed. He didn't play with Roberto much, didn't help with diapers or night feedings. When Carmen asked him to be more involved, he'd say he was tired from work, that providing for the family was his job and raising children was hers. Traditional division of labor, the way his parents had done it. Carmen bit back arguments because fighting seemed pointless and exhausting. She focused on Roberto instead, on his first words and first steps, and the way he laughed when she made funny faces. The first real crack appeared when Roberto was 3. Miguel came home one Friday and announced he'd been offered a job in the United States, in Chicago, at a parts supplier. Better pay, he said, opportunities, a chance to build something. Carmen's stomach had dropped. Leave Mexico, leave her family, her mother who was getting older, her sisters, everything familiar? Miguel insisted. This was their future. This was for Roberto, so he could grow up with advantages, American education, American opportunities. When Carmen hesitated, Miguel's face hardened in a way she'd never seen before. He said he was going with or without her. She could come or she could stay, but he wasn't passing this up. So she went. Because what choice did she have, really, with a 3-year-old child and no job skills beyond sewing and cooking? They moved to Chicago in the spring, to Pilsen, where there were other Mexican families, where Spanish was spoken on every corner. Miguel found them an apartment above what used to be a corner store, 2 small rooms and a bathroom that leaked when it rained. He started work immediately. Carmen was alone in a strange city where she knew no one, where the English words on signs and television seemed impossible to decode, where even the air felt different, heavier with moisture and industrial smells. Miguel's hours got longer. He worked overtime, took extra shifts. The money was good, he said. They were saving, but he was never home. And when he was home, he was distant, watching Spanish-language television with a beer, not really seeing Carmen or Roberto. Carmen started to understand that Miguel hadn't brought them to Chicago for family. He'd brought them because it was expected, because a man doesn't abandon his wife and child. But his heart, whatever part of him was capable of connection, had already left years ago. Maybe it had never been there at all. She noticed the perfume on his shirts when she did laundry. She noticed the unexplained absences, the phone calls he took in another room. When she confronted him, Miguel didn't even bother lying. He said some things were none of her business, that she should be grateful for the roof over her head and the money he provided. Carmen realized then, with a clarity that felt like ice water, that she'd married a stranger, that she'd built a life with someone who felt nothing for her, that she was alone in a foreign country with a young child and a husband who treated her like an inconvenient obligation. The divorce was quick and cold. Miguel didn't fight for custody, didn't fight for anything really. He agreed to child support payments that he'd later frequently skip. Within 6 months, he had a new girlfriend, an American woman he'd met at work. Within a year, he'd moved to Indiana for another job, and his visits with Roberto became sporadic, then rare, then non-existent. By the time Roberto was 7, Miguel was just a name on irregular checks, a photograph in a drawer, a man who called on Roberto's birthday, if he remembered. Carmen didn't cry about it, couldn't afford to cry about it. She had to figure out how to survive. Her English was still poor, limiting her job options. She had no family nearby, no support system, but she could cook. Her mother had taught her to make birria the traditional way, the recipe passed down through generations, the exact balance of chilies and spices and slow cooking that made the meat fall apart tender, that made the consommé rich and complex. She started cooking for other families in the building, selling plates of birria on weekends. Word spread. People started coming to her door, placing orders. She made enough to supplement the irregular child support, to keep them fed and housed. When Roberto was 8, the corner store below their apartment went out of business. Carmen looked at that empty space and saw possibility. She had some money saved, enough for first month's rent and basic equipment. She convinced the landlord to take a chance on her. She opened Martinez Birria, a tiny restaurant with 6 tables and a kitchen that was barely more than a hot plate and a stock pot. She worked 7 days a week, 16 hours a day. She cooked overnight, slow roasting goat and beef, preparing consommé in huge batches. She opened at dawn for the construction workers heading to job sites. She stayed open late for the factory workers coming off second shift. Roberto grew up in that restaurant, doing homework at table 3, falling asleep in the corner booth. Carmen taught him to help when he was old enough, washing dishes, wiping tables, taking orders. She saved every dollar she could. When he needed school supplies, she bought them. When he wanted to join the soccer team, she paid the fees. When he came home excited about robotics club, she found the money for the parts. She watched other mothers in the neighborhood, women who had time to attend school events and volunteer in classrooms, and felt a quiet burning shame that she couldn't do those things. But she was building something. Every plate of birria sold was another brick in the foundation of Roberto's future. Everything seemed fine, normal. Until Roberto turned 13 and started to be embarrassed by the restaurant, by the smell of cooking meat that clung to his clothes, by the way his mother spoke English with a heavy accent, by the fact that they lived above a business in a working-class neighborhood while his friends from school lived in houses with yards. That was the first time Carmen saw something in her son's eyes that scared her, a kind of contempt, a wish that she was different, that they were different. He started asking her not to come to school events, started lying to friends about what his mother did for work, started spending more time away from the restaurant, away from her. Carmen told herself it was normal teenage stuff, that all kids went through phases of being embarrassed by their parents. She doubled down on work, determined to give him opportunities to transcend the life she could provide. She found scholarship information for private high schools. She pushed him to study, to get good grades, to aim higher than the neighborhood. When he got accepted to a prep school on the north side, she worked extra hours to cover the portion the scholarship didn't pay. Roberto thrived there, made new friends, learned new things. But he also learned to code switch, to become someone else outside of Pilsen. The boy who came home on weekends was different from the boy who left on Monday mornings. Quieter, more distant, more like his father. Looking back now, lying in that hospital bed, Carmen could see the pattern forming. The way Roberto started correcting her English in front of his friends, the way he stopped inviting those friends over, the way he'd tense up when she hugged him goodbye at the train station, glancing around to see if anyone from his school was watching. Small moments that she'd rationalized at the time, telling herself it was normal, that he was just finding himself, that the distance was temporary. But those moments were seeds, and what grew from them eventually became the man who sent a business card to his mother's hospital room with an excuse about a client dinner. Carmen had believed, truly believed, that sacrifice would be rewarded with gratitude, that if she gave enough, worked hard enough, loved fiercely enough, Roberto would see it and appreciate it and never forget where he came from. She'd built her entire adult life on that belief. The restaurant, the long hours, the missed moments of her own life, all of it had been for him. So he could have better, so he could be better. And maybe that was her first mistake. Maybe you can't build a relationship on debt, can't make someone love you by martyring yourself for them. But she'd done it anyway, and now she was here, in a hospital bed at 72, holding a business card and realizing that somewhere along the way, her son had learned to see her as an inconvenience. The subtle foreshadowing had been there all along if she'd let herself see it. The way Roberto talked about his prep school friends' families, always mentioning their houses in nice suburbs, their parents' professional careers, the way he'd suggested when he was 16 that maybe Carmen should hire someone to run the restaurant so she could do something else, as if the restaurant wasn't her life's work, as if it was something to be handed off, outsourced, made irrelevant. She'd laughed it off then, but the comment stuck. The implication that what she did wasn't important enough to do herself, or the time he brought a girlfriend home from college, a blonde girl named Madison whose parents were doctors. Carmen had made her best birria, set the table nicely, tried to make conversation. Madison had been polite, but visibly uncomfortable, and afterwards Roberto had snapped at Carmen for asking Madison too many questions, for making things awkward. Carmen had apologized, confused about what she'd done wrong. She was just trying to get to know the girl her son was dating. But Roberto said she didn't understand how things worked, that she was too intense, too nosy. The girlfriend didn't last, but the criticism did, settling into Carmen's understanding of how her son saw her. There was the argument when Roberto got accepted to law school. Carmen had been overjoyed, proud, ready to help however she could. Roberto had looked at her seriously and said he needed money for living expenses, that loans would only cover tuition. Carmen had offered to remortgage the restaurant. Roberto had said no, not a mortgage, a sale. Sell the building, he said, sell everything, invest in his education. He'd pay her back later, set her up comfortably. Carmen had refused.
Horrified. The restaurant was her life, her identity, her independence. Roberto had been angry, accused her of not believing in him, of prioritizing a small business over his future. They didn't speak for 2 months. Eventually, Carmen had found another way, taking on debt, working even longer hours. But Roberto's suggestion stayed with her. The casual way he'd proposed she erase everything she'd built. These moments seemed innocent at the time, easy to explain away. Teenagers are moody, young adults are self-centered. He was stressed about school. He didn't understand the restaurant's importance because he'd never had to build something from nothing. Carmen had supplied excuses for every red flag, had smoothed over every rough edge, had convinced herself that their relationship was fine underneath it all, that when Roberto was older and established, he'd understand, and they'd be close again. What she believed about their relationship, fundamentally, was that blood was enough. That being his mother counted for something permanent and unbreakable. That all the years of sacrifice created a bond that couldn't be severed by ambition or embarrassment or the pull of a different life. She believed in a contract she'd never actually signed, an unspoken agreement that she'd give everything, and he'd be grateful, that she'd build him up, and he'd never forget it, that her love would guarantee his loyalty. She thought she was building a foundation for their future relationship.
She didn't realize she was building a wall between them, brick by brick, with every sacrifice he didn't ask for and couldn't repay. The life she thought she was building looked like this. In her imagination, Roberto would finish law school, start his career, make good money. He'd remember his mother then, would want to share his success with her, would insist on helping her the way she'd helped him. Maybe he'd pay off the restaurant's debt. Maybe he'd buy her a small house somewhere quiet where she could finally rest. They'd have dinners together, real conversations. He'd bring his future wife and children to meet her, and she'd be the beloved grandmother, the matriarch who'd made it all possible. Her sacrifice would be rewarded not with money, but with connection, with being valued, with being seen. That was the dream she'd worked toward for decades. A future where her son loved her not out of obligation, but out of genuine appreciation and affection. Instead, she got a business card with an excuse, and that's when everything she'd built, all those years of careful rationalization and forced optimism, came crashing down. Everything seemed fine, normal, until the moment it wasn't, until the structure could no longer hold the weight of its own contradictions. It started with the headaches. Carmen had been getting them for months, dull pressure behind her eyes that she attributed to stress and long hours. Then the dizzy spells, moments where the restaurant kitchen would tilt and swim and she'd have to grip the counter until it passed. She ignored them. She'd always pushed through discomfort, had built her whole life on the principle that you keep going no matter what. Tough it out, work through it. Rest is for other people, people who have the luxury of stopping. The morning it happened was a Tuesday, early March, one of those Chicago days where winter hasn't quite released its grip. Carmen had been up since 4 preparing for the breakfast rush. She'd slept maybe 3 hours, collapsed on her bed upstairs around 1 after finishing the overnight cooking. Her body moved through the familiar routines on autopilot. Chop the onions, toast the chilies, check the meat. Her hands knew the work so well she didn't have to think about it, which was good because thinking was becoming difficult. The headache had sharpened into something with teeth. Her vision kept blurring at the edges. Around 7:30, the breakfast rush in full swing, Carmen walked from the kitchen to the dining room carrying a tray of plates. She remembered the weight of it, the smell of fresh tortillas and consommé. She remembered seeing the customers at table 2, construction workers she recognized from years of serving them. She remembered taking a step toward their table. And then the floor came up to meet her in a way that felt both sudden and inevitable, like something that had been waiting to happen for a long time. The tray went flying. She heard the crash of breaking plates, the splash of hot consommé hitting the floor. She felt her knees hit first, then her hands, catching herself but not quite, her left side crumpling. Pain shot through her hip, bright and sharp. More alarming was the way her vision tunneled, darkness creeping in from all sides. She heard voices, concerned and distant, as if she was underwater, felt hands on her shoulders, someone asking if she was okay, if she could hear them. She tried to answer, but her mouth wouldn't form words properly. The next clear moment was sitting on the floor back against the wall, while Jorge from table 2 called 911. His wife Rosa had grabbed a jacket to put under Carmen's head. The other customers hovered, uncertain, wanting to help, but not knowing how. Carmen felt humiliated, weak, furious at her body for betraying her like this. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. Everything hurt. The pain in her hip was excruciating. Her wrist, where she'd caught herself, was swelling. But worse than the physical pain was the shame. Her restaurant, her business. She was supposed to be in control here, supposed to be the capable one, the person who kept everything running. Now she was on the floor, surrounded by broken plates and spilled food, being tended to by her own customers. The ambulance arrived within 10 minutes. The paramedics were efficient and kind, asking her questions she struggled to answer. What day is it? Where does it hurt? Do you have any medical conditions? When did you last eat? Carmen couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a full meal. Yesterday? The day before? Food was something she served to others, not something she had time for herself. The paramedics exchanged a look she recognized even through her confused haze: concern, professional worry. They checked her blood pressure and made quiet notes. One of them, a young woman with her hair in a neat bun, said gently that Carmen was severely dehydrated, that her blood pressure was dangerously low, that they needed to take her to the hospital right away. Carmen tried to protest. The restaurant. She couldn't leave. Who would cover the lunch rush? Who would prep for dinner? Rosa, still kneeling beside her, said firmly that she'd take care of it, that she'd call her daughter, who'd worked in restaurants before, that Carmen needed to stop worrying and get help. The paramedics lifted Carmen onto a stretcher, strapping her in with practiced efficiency. The ceiling of her restaurant passed overhead, water-stained and familiar. Then the sky, grey and cold. Then the inside of the ambulance, clean and bright and terrifying. At the hospital, everything became a blur of procedures: blood draws, x-rays, an IV line inserted into her hand, fluids pumping in cold and strange, doctors and nurses asking more questions. Did she have family to call? Emergency contacts? Carmen gave them Roberto's number, the cell phone she had memorized but rarely used because he never answered when she called. The nurse said she'd try to reach him, asked if there was anyone else. Carmen shook her head. No one else. Just her son. She waited in the emergency room, curtained off from the rest of the chaos, listening to alarms and conversations and the general machinery of crisis management. The IV made her feel slightly better, less like she was going to pass out, but the hip pain was intense. The doctor, a tired-looking man in his 40s with kind eyes, came back with her X-ray results. No fracture, thank God, but severe bruising. The wrist was sprained but not broken. Blood work showed malnutrition and dehydration. He asked about her eating and sleeping habits. Carmen answered honestly because lying seemed pointless. 3 to 4 hours of sleep a night. Meals whenever she remembered, which wasn't often. Working 7 days a week, 16-hour days minimum. The doctor frowned, made notes on his tablet. He said what she was doing wasn't sustainable, that her body was shutting down from exhaustion. He used the word dangerous. Said if she didn't make changes, next time might be a stroke or a heart attack. Carmen listened with a strange detachment, as if he was talking about someone else. She'd been working like this for over 40 years. It was who she was. Telling her to work less was like telling her to be a different person entirely. They moved her to a regular room, said they wanted to keep her overnight for observation, make sure the fluids helped, monitor her condition. Carmen lay in the hospital bed feeling displaced and strange, like she'd been removed from her own life. The clock on the wall said 2:15. Lunch rush would be ending soon at the restaurant. She wondered if Rosa had managed, if any customers had been turned away, if the burners were all turned off properly. Her mind couldn't let go of the details, the running checklist that normally governed every waking moment. Around 3, she asked the nurse if anyone had called back. The nurse checked her phone, made a call to Roberto's number while Carmen listened. It rang several times, then went to voicemail. The nurse left a message. Professional. Clear. Your mother Carmen Martinez has been hospitalized. Please call this number. The nurse hung up, gave Carmen an encouraging smile. "He's probably just busy," she said. "I'm sure he'll call back soon." Carmen waited. The IV dripped. The monitors beeped. Other patients in nearby rooms made various sounds of distress or recovery. She watched the clock, minutes ticking past with aggressive slowness. 4 o'clock, 4:30, 5, no call. At 5:30, the nurse tried again. Same result. Voicemail. Another message left. This time, the nurse's expression was less optimistic. She said sometimes people have their phones off during work, that she'd keep trying. At 6:15, a different nurse came in, the evening shift taking over. She had Roberto's business card in her hand, said someone from his office had called back. Not Roberto himself, but an assistant. The assistant had explained that Mr. Martinez was in back-to-back meetings all day, that he'd gotten the messages but couldn't step away. He wanted to know his mother's condition. The nurse had explained the situation. The assistant had said she'd pass the information along, that Mr. Martinez would try to visit after work. Carmen felt something crack inside her chest, a physical sensation like ice breaking. Not Roberto himself, an assistant. As if his mother's hospitalization was a business matter to be delegated. The nurse seemed to sense her distress, patted her hand awkwardly, said she was sure he'd come soon. Carmen didn't argue, didn't have the energy to explain that she was beginning to understand something fundamental about her relationship with her son, something she'd been avoiding for years. 7 o'clock passed. 7:30. 8. Visiting hours starting to wind down. Carmen stared at the ceiling, at the acoustic tiles with their random patterns of holes, and felt the weight of her entire life pressing down on her. All those years, all that work, all those sacrifices. And when she actually needed him, when she was hurt and scared and alone in a hospital, her son couldn't find 2 hours to see her. At 8:30, her doctor came back to check on her. He asked if her son had arrived. Carmen said no. The doctor's face did something complicated, sympathy and disappointment, and maybe a touch of anger. He said he'd spoken to Roberto's assistant earlier, had explained that Carmen was in serious condition, that this was a significant health event requiring family support. The assistant had apparently asked for details, taken notes. The doctor had been clear. This was urgent, important. Carmen asked what the assistant had said. The doctor hesitated, clearly debating how much to share. Then he seemed to decide that honesty was more respectful than protection. He said the assistant had relayed a message from Roberto, that he had an important client dinner scheduled for tonight, something that had been planned for weeks, very high stakes, that he'd try to visit tomorrow morning before work if his mother's condition was stable. The doctor paused, then added that the assistant had specifically asked if the situation was life-threatening, and when he'd said no, she'd seemed to imply that visiting could wait. The room went very quiet. Carmen could hear her own breathing, the mechanical beep of the monitor. Important client dinner, high stakes, if the situation was life-threatening. The words arranged themselves in her mind like pieces of evidence, building a case she didn't want to acknowledge. Her son had heard that his 72-year-old mother had collapsed and been hospitalized, and his first question had been whether she was actively dying. When the answer was no, he'd decided his business obligations took priority. The doctor looked genuinely upset on her behalf. He said, very carefully, that family dynamics weren't his business, but in his experience, when a parent was hospitalized, most children found a way to visit, high-stakes client dinner or not. He said it kindly, but Carmen heard the judgment underneath. The same judgment she'd been fighting her whole life, the assumption that if your child doesn't value you, you must have done something wrong, must have failed somehow as a parent. She thanked the doctor, her voice steady even though her hands were shaking. He left, promising to check on her in the morning. Carmen lay in the dark room. She'd refused to turn on the television, couldn't stand the artificial noise, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. Not grief exactly, though there was grief in it. More like a kind of clarity. A veil being pulled back. All the excuses she'd made for Roberto over the years, all the ways she'd rationalized his distance and his embarrassment and his neglect suddenly seemed like exactly what they were. Excuses, rationalizations, lies she'd told herself because the truth was too painful. The truth was that her son saw her as an obligation at best, an inconvenience at worst. The truth was that all her sacrifice hadn't created gratitude or loyalty or love. It had created distance, maybe even contempt. She'd worked herself to the bone to give him opportunities, and he'd taken those opportunities and used them to build a life as far from her as possible. Not geographically, they both lived in Chicago, but spiritually, emotionally, in every way that mattered, he'd left her behind. Carmen tried to cry but couldn't. The tears wouldn't come. She just lay there, feeling hollowed out and ancient, while the business cards sat on the bedside table next to a cup of water and a box of tissues. The embossed letters caught the light from the hallway. Roberto Martinez, Esquire, her son, the boy she'd raised alone, fed from her own labor, protected and provided for. Now a stranger in an expensive suit who couldn't spare 2 hours for the woman who'd given him everything. At 9:45, as Carmen was finally drifting into an exhausted half-sleep, her phone rang. Not the hospital phone, her personal cell, plugged into the wall charger. She fumbled for it, heart jumping stupidly with hope. Roberto's name on the screen, she answered, her voice coming out rough. "Hello?" Background noise, restaurant sounds, laughter and conversation and clinking glasses. Roberto's voice, casual, slightly distracted. "Hey, Mom, got your messages? How are you feeling?" As if she'd texted him about a cold, not being brought to the hospital by ambulance. Carmen's hand tightened on the phone. She said she'd collapsed at the restaurant, that she was being kept overnight, that the doctor said she was dangerously exhausted and malnourished. A pause. Roberto said, "Oh, that sounded serious." Was she going to be okay? Carmen said yes, probably, with rest. Another pause. Roberto said that was good, that he was glad she was okay. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said he had this client dinner tonight, really important, but he'd try to swing by tomorrow. Carmen asked what time tomorrow. Roberto's voice got vaguer. Sometime in the morning, he'd have to see. He had a full schedule. Carmen said the doctor wanted to discharge her by noon if her blood pressure stabilized. Could Roberto please come before that? It had been months since they'd seen each other properly. She needed to talk to him about some things. Roberto made a non-committal sound. He'd try, no promises. Depended on how the morning went. More background noise, someone calling his name. He said he had to go, that he'd call tomorrow. The line went dead before Carmen could respond. She set the phone down carefully, as if it might break, or as if she might throw it. The business card seemed to mock her from the bedside table. Tomorrow morning, no promises, depended on how the morning went. Her son was at a restaurant right now, probably somewhere expensive in the Loop, eating a meal that cost more than she charged for 3 birria plates, laughing with clients, building his career. And his mother was in a hospital bed with a bruised hip and a sprained wrist and malnutrition, and he couldn't be bothered to leave early to check on her, to sit with her for even an hour. That was the moment something in Carmen died. Not her love for Roberto. She wasn't sure you could stop loving your child even when they hurt you. But her hope. Her belief that someday things would change, that he'd come back to her, that the distance was temporary, that died completely. And in its place grew something harder, something that understood with perfect clarity that she'd been financing her own abandonment, that every sacrifice she'd made had funded Roberto's escape from her, that the restaurant she'd refused to sell, the life she'd built, the independence she'd maintained, those weren't holding her back from some better relationship with her son. They were the only things protecting her from complete irrelevance in his life. Carmen made a decision then, lying in that hospital bed in the dark. It wasn't a decision made from anger, though there was anger in it. It was made from survival instinct, from the same fierce determination that had gotten her through a divorce in a foreign country, through decades of exhausting work, through every hardship she'd faced. She decided that if Roberto saw her as a business relationship, as something to be managed at his convenience, then she'd treat it like a business relationship too. And in business, you protect your assets. You don't give them away to people who don't value them. The night passed in fitful sleep, interrupted by nurses checking vitals and the general sleeplessness of hospitals. Carmen woke feeling sore and tired, but clearer-headed than she'd been in years. The morning nurse brought breakfast, hospital food, that was bland, but she forced herself to eat it, to drink the juice and the coffee. The doctor came by around 8, pleased with her improvement. He said she could likely go home that afternoon if her blood pressure stayed stable, but she needed to make serious changes. Less work, better sleep, actual meals. Carmen nodded, agreed to everything. She had a different plan forming, but she kept it to herself. At 9:30, while Carmen was filling out discharge paperwork, Roberto appeared in the doorway. He looked exactly like his business card, professional and polished and expensive. Dark suit, crisp white shirt, silk tie in a subtle pattern. Hair perfectly styled. Shoes that probably cost more than Carmen's monthly grocery budget. He carried a bouquet of flowers, the kind you grab from the hospital gift shop, and a coffee from some chain. He smiled, the practiced smile of someone who does a lot of client relations, and said, "Hey, Mom, sorry I couldn't make it last night. The dinner ran really late." Carmen looked at him and saw a stranger wearing her son's face. She said it was fine. "Thank you for coming." Roberto set the flowers on the bedside table, handed her the coffee which she didn't want, but accepted. He sat in the visitor's chair, crossed his legs, glanced at his watch. A quick visit then. He had a conference call at 10:30. Carmen said she understood. She knew he was busy. They made small talk for exactly 7 minutes. Roberto asked about her injuries. She said they'd heal. He asked about the restaurant. She said Rosa and her daughter had managed the previous day, that she'd work something out. Roberto suggested again that maybe she should think about selling, that she was getting older, that this kind of incident proved she couldn't keep working like this. Carmen smiled and said she'd think about it. Roberto seemed satisfied with that answer, ready to leave. Then Carmen said casually that she'd been thinking about other things too, about the building. Roberto's expression sharpened slightly, attention focusing. The building that housed the restaurant was in Carmen's name, purchased years ago when property in Pilsen was still affordable. But the second floor, the space that had once been storage, Roberto had converted it into his first law office 5 years ago. Cheap rent from family while he was establishing his practice. He'd promised it was temporary, just until he got on his feet. Then he'd made partner at the bigger firm, but he'd kept that second-floor office, using it for meeting with certain clients who preferred somewhere more local, more accessible than the downtown high-rise. Carmen had never complained, had charged him minimal rent, essentially subsidizing his business. Roberto asked, what she was thinking about regarding the building. Carmen said, well, the property was in her name. Technically, she owned his office space. Roberto's face went very still. Technically, he repeated. Carmen said yes, technically and actually. She'd never transferred the deed, never made it official. He'd been using the space as a courtesy, family helping family. Roberto's jaw tightened. He asked where she was going with this. Carmen said nowhere, just thinking out loud, just realizing that if something happened to her, if she hadn't updated her will properly, things could get complicated. Roberto asked if she'd updated her will. Carmen said not recently, maybe she should. The air in the hospital room changed, charged with something unspoken. Roberto asked, very carefully, what she was planning to do. Carmen said she hadn't decided, maybe talk to a lawyer herself, make sure everything was clear and legal, protect her interests. Roberto stood up, the friendly sun act evaporating. He said she was being ridiculous, that family didn't need lawyers between them, that she was obviously upset about the hospitalization and not thinking clearly. Carmen said actually she was thinking more clearly than she had in years. Roberto said what was that supposed to mean? Carmen said nothing, just that she was reevaluating some decisions. Roberto looked at his mother, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years, and what he saw seemed to alarm him. Not a frail old woman he could manage with occasional visits and empty promises. Someone who'd just realized she had power and might use it. He said they should talk about this later when she was home and rested, not in a hospital room when she was clearly not herself. Carmen said she was completely herself, maybe more than she'd been in a long time. Roberto checked his watch again, said he really had to go, that conference call. He'd call her later. They'd sort this out. He left without the flowers he'd brought, without finishing the visit properly, practically fleeing. Carmen watched him go and felt nothing. No sadness, no anger, just a cold clarity. She'd spent decades trying to earn her son's love through sacrifice. It hadn't worked. Maybe it was time to try something different. Maybe it was time to make sure that if he didn't value her as a mother, he'd at least respect her as the person who owned the property his business operated from. The nurse came in to check on her, found Carmen sitting up in bed staring at the business card still on the bedside table. Asked if she was okay. Carmen said yes. Better than she'd been in years. The nurse looked skeptical, but didn't push. Sometimes, Carmen thought, you have to break before you can start putting yourself back together properly. Sometimes the collapse is necessary, and sometimes the person who abandons you gives you exactly the clarity you need to save yourself. 3 days after Carmen was discharged from the hospital, she met with a lawyer. Not one of Roberto's colleagues, not anyone connected to his professional circle. She found Maria Gonzalez through a friend at church, a woman in her 50s who specialized in family law and estate planning. Maria's office was in a modest building in Pilsen, decorated with family photos and degrees from DePaul, comfortable and professional, without the aggressive corporate polish of Roberto's world. Carmen liked her immediately, trusted the directness in her eyes. Maria listened to the whole story without interrupting. The hospitalization, Roberto's absence, the phone call from the client dinner, the perfunctory visit the next morning, the years of sacrifice and the growing distance, the property situation with the restaurant, and the office space. When Carmen finished, Maria sat back in her chair and said, very simply, "Tell me what you want. Not what you think you should want, not what would be fair or right or maternal. What do you actually want?" Carmen had thought about this question for 3 sleepless nights. What she wanted was impossible. She wanted her son to love her the way she loved him, to value her, to choose her. But you can't make someone love you. You can't force gratitude or loyalty or genuine care. So what was possible? She said she wanted to protect herself. She wanted to make sure that when she was really old, truly unable to work, she wouldn't be dependent on someone who saw her as an inconvenience. She wanted leverage, insurance. Some guarantee that Roberto couldn't just ignore her completely, couldn't relegate her to the category of problems to be handled by assistants. Maria nodded slowly. She asked about Carmen's assets. The building was paid off, owned free and clear. The restaurant business itself, the equipment and inventory and goodwill. Some savings, not much. A small retirement account. Maria asked about debts. Some remaining medical bills, manageable. She asked about Roberto's use of the office space. Carmen explained the arrangement, the minimal rent that barely covered utilities, the verbal agreement that had never been formalized. Maria pulled out a legal pad, started taking notes. "Here's what I recommend," Maria said. "First, update your will. Make it crystal clear who owns what and what happens to your assets. Second, formalize the office rental agreement. Market rate rent, proper lease, everything legal and documented. Third, consider what you want the property situation to be long-term. You could sell it to Roberto at market value if he wants to buy it. You could keep it and increase the rent. You could ask him to find different office space." Maria paused, made eye contact. "This isn't about punishment," she said. "This is about treating a business arrangement like a business arrangement. If he wants to keep your relationship purely transactional, fine. But transactions go both ways." Carmen felt something settle in her chest, a rightness to this approach. She asked what Roberto would say, what the legal situation was. Maria said legally, Carmen was completely within her rights. The property was hers. She could set whatever terms she wanted for its use. Roberto had no claim to it beyond whatever verbal agreement they'd had. And verbal agreements aren't worth much when family dynamics break down. As for what he'd say, Maria smiled slightly. Probably a lot. People get very upset when they realize they don't have the power they thought they had. They spent 2 hours working through details. Maria would draft a new will, clear and explicit. She'd prepare a formal rental agreement for the office space, market rate, which in that area of Pilsen was now considerable, given the neighborhood's gentrification. She'd also prepare documents that would give Carmen options, an option for Roberto to purchase the building at appraised value within a certain time frame, or an option for Carmen to reclaim the space with proper notice. Everything professional, everything legal, everything designed to protect Carmen's interests. Over the next 2 weeks, Carmen focused on recovering physically while the legal wheels turned. She hired help at the restaurant, 2 part-time workers to cover shifts, so she could actually rest, actually sleep more than 4 hours a night. Rosa's daughter Lupita turned out to be excellent, reliable, and hard-working. Carmen started eating regular meals, taking the vitamins her doctor prescribed, treating her body less like a machine to be driven and more like something that needed care. Roberto called a few times during those weeks, brief conversations where he asked how she was feeling, and she said fine, recovering. He didn't offer to visit, didn't offer help with the restaurant, just the minimum check-ins required to maintain the appearance of being a dutiful son. Carmen kept her tone pleasant and neutral. She didn't mention the lawyer or the documents being prepared. That conversation would come soon enough. The paperwork was ready in mid-April. Maria called Carmen to her office, showed her everything. The will was clear and comprehensive. The rental agreement was professional and fair, charging what any business would charge for that amount of office space in that location. The purchase option gave Roberto first right of refusal if Carmen ever decided to sell, but at market value, appraised by a neutral third party. Everything was designed to be legally unassailable while also being fundamentally reasonable. No court would see this as a mother being vindictive. This was simply a property owner formalizing an informal arrangement. Carmen signed everything. Maria had the documents notarized, made copies, prepared a packet to send to Roberto via registered mail so there'd be proof of receipt. She also prepared a cover letter, professional and concise, explaining the situation. Dear Roberto, after recent health events, I have decided to formalize my estate planning and business arrangements. Please find enclosed documents regarding the property at the address of Martinez Beria. Going forward, your office rental will be subject to the attached lease agreement. Please review and sign by May 1st. The letter went on to explain the purchase option and the updated will's existence, all in neutral legal language that somehow felt more devastating than any emotional plea could have been. When Carmen asked when to send it, Maria said that was up to her. Did she want to tell Roberto first, have a conversation, before the legal documents arrived? Or did she want the documents to speak for themselves? Carmen thought about the business card on her hospital bedside table, the excuse about the client dinner, the 7-minute hospital visit. She said, send them. No warning, no conversation. Let him find out the same way he'd informed her he couldn't visit, through impersonal communication, business as business. Maria sent the packet on a Wednesday. Roberto would receive it Thursday or Friday. Carmen waited, maintaining her routines at the restaurant, working shortened hours with her new help, feeling stronger each day. The bruises from her fall had faded to yellow-green. Her wrist no longer ached. She was sleeping better, eating better. The restaurant ran smoothly, even without her presence every single minute. Part of her wondered why she'd never done this before, never allowed herself help, never built in sustainable systems. Pride, maybe, or fear. Fear that if she wasn't indispensable, she'd be disposable. Friday afternoon, Carmen was at the restaurant during the lunch rush when her phone rang. Roberto. She let it go to voicemail. He called again immediately. She declined the call. A text message appeared. We need to talk, now. Carmen set her phone face down on the counter and continued taking an order from a regular customer, an older man who always got the same thing, birria tacos with extra consomme. The phone buzzed repeatedly. She ignored it. Saturday morning, Roberto showed up at the restaurant. Carmen was there early, as always, prep work for the day. She heard the door open, looked up from chopping cilantro, and there was her son, but not the polished professional version. This Roberto looked rattled, tie loosened, hair not quite perfect. He was holding the packet of legal documents, waving them slightly. What the hell is this? He said. No greeting, no how are you feeling, just immediate confrontation. Carmen set down her knife carefully. She said it was exactly what it looked like. Legal documents formalizing their business arrangement. Roberto said this was insane, that she couldn't just spring this on him, that they needed to discuss it. Carmen pointed out that she'd tried to discuss things in the hospital and he'd left after 7 minutes to make a conference call. This seemed more efficient. Roberto's face flushed. He said that was different, that was family stuff, this was his business. Carmen said precisely, this was business. So she was treating it like business. Roberto slammed the documents on the counter, making Carmen's carefully arranged mise en place jump. He said the rent in that lease was triple what he was paying now. Carmen said actually it was market rate. She'd had it appraised. Roberto said she was trying to gouge him. Carmen said no, she was charging him the same amount she'd charge any other tenant. He said he wasn't any other tenant, he was her son. Carmen said then maybe he should have acted like her son when she was in the hospital. The argument escalated. Roberto said she was being manipulative, using money to punish him for not being the perfect son. Carmen said she wasn't punishing anyone, she was protecting herself, making sure her business affairs were in order. Roberto said if she needed money, she should just ask, not do this passive-aggressive legal nonsense. Carmen laughed, actually laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. She said she didn't need his money, she had her own money, she'd always had her own money. What she'd needed was for him to visit when she was hospitalized. What she'd needed was for him to care. Roberto went quiet, looked at her with something like recognition, seeing, maybe for the first time, how hurt she was. He said more gently that he was sorry about the hospital thing, that the timing was bad, that he'd had obligations. Carmen said everyone has obligations. The question is which obligations you prioritize. Roberto had made his priorities very clear. Roberto protested that it wasn't that simple, that she didn't understand the pressure he was under, the expectations in his career. Carmen said she understood perfectly. She'd worked under pressure and expectations her entire life. She just hadn't used them as an excuse to neglect the people who loved her. Roberto tried a different approach. He said, look, could they start over? Could they talk about this reasonably? He'd visit more. He'd make more effort. They could work something out about the rent, some kind of family discount. Carmen said no, no family discount. If he wanted to use the space, he'd pay market rate like any other tenant. If he wanted to buy the building, she'd sell it to him at appraised value. If he wanted to find different office space, she'd give him 60 days' notice per the lease. Those were his options, business options, since that seemed to be the only language he understood. Roberto looked at his mother like he was seeing a different person. Maybe he was. The woman who'd always said yes, who'd always accommodated, who'd worked herself into the ground for his sake, was gone. In her place was someone who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to demand it be recognized. He asked what she wanted from him. Carmen said she wanted him to either be her son in truth, not just in name, or to be an honest business associate. But she was done with the middle ground where she pretended they had a close relationship while he treated her like an inconvenience. Roberto said she was being unfair, that he did care about her, that just because he was busy didn't mean he didn't love her. Carmen asked when the last time he'd visited just to visit was, not because of a crisis or an obligation. When the last time he'd called to ask how she was, not to ask for something or relay information. When the last time he'd spent more than an hour in her presence. Roberto couldn't answer. The silence stretched between them, full of years of neglect and rationalization and the slow erosion of a relationship. Finally, Roberto picked up the documents from the counter. He said fine. He'd review them with his lawyer. He'd make a decision about the space. But she was making a mistake, treating family like a business transaction. Carmen said he'd been treating her like a business transaction for years. She was just finally returning the favor. Roberto shook his head, started to leave, then turned back. He said, you know what, maybe you're right. Maybe I have been distant. But you made it impossible to be anything else. You worked all the time. You were never available for anything but the restaurant. You built this wall between us, and now you're mad I'm on the other side of it. Carmen felt that accusation land, felt the partial truth of it. She had worked constantly. She had prioritized the restaurant. But she said, I worked for you. Everything I did was for you. Roberto said, I never asked you to sacrifice your whole life for me. I never asked you to martyr yourself and then hold it over my head. Carmen said she'd never held it over his head. She'd just hoped he'd remember, that he'd appreciate. Roberto said, how could I appreciate something I never wanted? You gave and gave and gave and made me feel guilty for existing, for costing you so much. The words hung in the air between them, toxic and revelatory. Carmen realized with stunning clarity that they'd been having two completely different relationships. She'd thought she was investing in his love. He'd thought she was building a debt he could never repay, using her sacrifice as a weapon. Neither of them had been right. Neither of them had been entirely wrong. They'd built a dynamic that poisoned everything, where her giving created his guilt, which created his distance, which created her hurt, which created more giving, a cycle that had been spiraling for decades. Carmen said quietly, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry if I made you feel guilty. That wasn't my intention. I just loved you. I wanted you to have opportunities." Roberto's eyes were wet. He said, I know you did, but your love felt like drowning, like I could never be enough, never do enough to make up for everything you gave up. So I stopped trying. I built a life where I didn't have to face it." They stood there in the early morning light of the restaurant, mother and son, seeing each other clearly maybe for the first time in years. All the ways they'd hurt each other. All the ways love had curdled into obligation and resentment. Carmen said, "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending we're close when we're not."
"I can't keep waiting for you to choose me when you never will." Roberto said, "What do you want from me?" Carmen said, "I want you to decide. Are you my son or are you my tenant? Because I need to know how to protect myself." Roberto looked at the documents in his hand. He said he'd think about it. He'd get back to her. Carmen said the lease terms were non-negotiable, market rate or find somewhere else.
Roberto nodded, defeated, and left. The door closed behind him with a soft chime. Carmen stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the smells of cilantro and lime and simmering meat, and felt something like relief. She'd said what needed saying. She'd drawn the boundary she needed to draw. Whatever happened now, at least she wasn't pretending anymore. The next few weeks were tense. Roberto didn't call, didn't visit. Carmen received a letter from his lawyer questioning some aspects of the lease, arguing that family arrangements should be honored differently. Maria responded with citations and case law, showing that Carmen's position was legally sound. Back and forth, professional and cold. The distance between them formalized in legal correspondence. Then in early May, Roberto signed the lease, agreed to the market rate rent, paid the first month and security deposit via check, like any other tenant. No note, no phone call, just compliance with the terms. Carmen deposited the check and felt nothing. Not victory, not satisfaction, just the hollow acknowledgement that her relationship with her son had officially become a business transaction. He'd made his choice. He'd rather pay her as a landlord than try to rebuild what they'd lost as family. Carmen threw herself into improving the restaurant. With the rental income and the help she'd hired, she had breathing room for the first time in decades. She updated the menu, added new dishes. She renovated the dining room, fresh paint and new tables. She started closing 1 day a week, Mondays, giving herself actual time off. She joined a seniors exercise class at the community center. She reconnected with old friends she'd neglected during the years of endless work. Roberto remained absent. The rent checks came on time every month, direct deposit, automatic and impersonal. Sometimes Carmen would walk past the office entrance on the second floor, hear voices from meetings, proof that her son was up there working, separated from her by 1 flight of stairs and an unbridgeable emotional distance. She wondered if he thought about her when he was up there, wondered if he felt any regret, or if he'd simply written her off as difficult, problematic, not worth the effort. Months passed. Summer turned to fall. The restaurant thrived with Carmen's renewed attention and energy. She hired Lupita full-time, started training her to manage shifts, thinking maybe about a future where Carmen could actually step back a little more. She went to her doctor for regular checkups. Her blood pressure was better. She'd gained back the weight she'd lost. She was sleeping. She was, by most measures, healthier and happier than she'd been in years, except for the hole where her son used to be. In November, Carmen's 73rd birthday came and went without acknowledgement from Roberto. No card, no call, no text. She'd half expected it, but the reality still stung. She celebrated with friends from church, people who actually showed up in her life, who asked how she was and meant it. It was nice, it was enough. But at night, alone in her apartment, she'd think about the birthday cakes she'd made for Roberto when he was young, the parties she'd thrown even when money was tight, the way she'd made every birthday special. And she'd wonder if he remembered any of it, if it meant anything to him now. December brought the first snow, blanketing Chicago in that brief, beautiful moment before it all turned to grey slush. Carmen was at the restaurant on a Tuesday afternoon, the slow time between lunch and dinner, when the door chimed and Roberto walked in. Not aggressive this time. Quiet, almost hesitant. Carmen looked up from the paperwork she was reviewing, felt her heart do something complicated. He looked tired, older somehow, though only months had passed. He asked if they could talk. Carmen gestured to a table. They sat across from each other like strangers, that terrible formality between them. Roberto said he'd been thinking a lot, about what she'd said, about their relationship, about everything. Carmen waited, didn't help him, didn't make it easier. He said he'd been angry at first about the lease,
about what he saw as manipulation. But then he'd talked to his therapist about it. He'd started therapy, he said, to deal with some stuff, work stress initially. But it had opened up a lot of other things. He said his therapist had pointed out that he'd spent his entire adult life running from guilt, from the feeling that he could never be enough, never repay what Carmen had sacrificed.
and running from that guilt meant running from Carmen, avoiding her, minimizing contact, treating their relationship like an obligation to be managed rather than something real. Roberto's voice cracked slightly. He said he was sorry, really sorry, not for the business arrangement, that was fair and he understood it, but for the hospital, for years of distance, for making excuses, for treating her like she didn't matter when she was the person who'd made his entire life possible. Carmen felt tears on her face and was surprised by them. She hadn't cried through any of this until now. Roberto reached across the table, hesitated, then took her hand. He said he didn't expect her to forgive him immediately. He didn't expect things to go back to normal, wasn't even sure what normal would mean for them. But he wanted to try, actually try, to build a relationship that wasn't based on guilt or obligation or transactions. Just, could they try? Carmen said she didn't know. She was tired of hoping and being disappointed, tired of making excuses for him. She said if he wanted to rebuild something, it had to be on different terms. She wouldn't keep working herself to death for him, wouldn't keep sacrificing everything. She had her own life now and she intended to keep it. If he wanted to be part of that life, he was welcome. But it had to be real. Not occasional visits when convenient, not phone calls when he needed something, real presence, real effort, real care. Roberto said he understood. He wanted that too. Could they start small? Dinner once a week maybe, here at the restaurant or somewhere else, whatever she preferred. Just time together without agenda or obligation. Carmen said okay, they could try that. But if he didn't show up, if he cancelled or blew her off, she was done. One chance, Roberto said that was fair. More than fair. He'd show up. he promised. They had dinner the following Thursday, just the two of them, after the restaurant closed. Carmen made birria the way she used to when Roberto was young, the recipe from her mother, prepared with care. They talked about small things at first: the weather, the restaurant renovations, Roberto's work in vague terms, then deeper things: Carmen's health, her new routines, her plans for the future, Roberto's therapy, the things he was learning about himself, the patterns he was trying to break. It was awkward sometimes, stilted. They'd forgotten how to be natural with each other. But it was real, more real than conversations they'd had in years. Roberto showed up the next week, and the week after that. Sometimes he'd bring food from a restaurant he'd discovered, sharing it with Carmen,
asking her professional opinion. Sometimes they'd cook together, Roberto relearning skills Carmen had taught him as a child, fumbling with knives and spices, making her laugh with his incompetence. Slowly, carefully, they were building something. Not what they'd had before that was gone, maybe had never really existed. But something new, something based on honesty rather than obligation.
choice rather than guilt. The rent checks continued, professional and on time. They didn't talk about the business arrangement during their dinners. It existed in parallel to their relationship, separate, a reminder of boundaries and consequences, but also of fairness. Carmen never offered to reduce the rent. Roberto never asked. They both understood that some things needed to stay clear and transactional precisely so other things could be emotional and genuine. By spring, things between them were better, not perfect. There were still tensions, still moments where old patterns resurfaced. But they were trying. Both of them, actively trying. Roberto had even started helping at the restaurant occasionally, waiting tables on busy weekends, reconnecting with the place that had raised him. Customers who remembered him as a child were delighted to see him back. Carmen watched him interact with them, saw glimpses of the boy he'd been before ambition and shame had driven them apart. Now, almost 2 years after that initial hospitalization, Carmen is 74 years old and running a successful restaurant with sustainable hours and good help. She has regular dinners with her son, a relationship that's complicated but real. She owns property that generates income and provides security. She has friends, hobbies, a life beyond constant work. Her health is good. She sleeps through the night. She's planning to take a vacation next winter, maybe visit Mexico, see family she hasn't seen in years. She's built a life that doesn't require her to sacrifice everything to feel valuable. Roberto is still a successful lawyer, still working intense hours, but he's made changes too. He's in therapy regularly. He's set better boundaries at work. He's learned to value relationships over pure career advancement. The office on the second floor above the restaurant is his, legally, through a fair lease that he honors. He pays his rent. He shows up for dinners. He's trying to be the son he never quite managed to be before, not out of guilt, but out of genuine desire to know his mother as a person. The business card that started everything is gone, thrown away long ago. Carmen doesn't need it as evidence anymore. The relationship speaks for itself now in weekly dinners and occasional phone calls, and the simple fact that when Carmen mentions something she needs, Roberto shows up. Not always immediately, not perfectly, but reliably. He's present in a way he wasn't before, and Carmen has stopped trying to earn that presence through sacrifice. She simply expects it as her right, as someone who deserves to be valued. The social dynamics around them have shifted too. Friends and family who watch the estrangement with concern are cautiously optimistic about the reconciliation. Carmen's church community, which supported her through the worst of it, sees her transformation as evidence of the power of setting boundaries. Some older women in the neighborhood have approached her privately, asking how she found the courage to demand better from her children. to stop accepting crumbs of attention. Carmen tells them what Maria the lawyer told her. You teach people how to treat you. If you accept being treated as an inconvenience, you'll always be an inconvenience. Roberto's colleagues and friends notice changes in him too. He's less obsessed with work, more willing to leave early or decline invitations to network. When asked about it, he says his priorities shifted, that he realized he was building a successful career but losing everything else that mattered. Some people understand, others think he's lost his edge, that he's letting personal stuff interfere with professional success. Roberto doesn't care as much as he would have before. The validation he used to seek from professional achievement, he's finding in other places now. Financially, the consequences of Carmen's decision have been significant. The market rate rent provides her real income, not the token amount she'd been charging before. Combined with the restaurant's improved profitability, now that she's running it sustainably, Carmen has actual savings for the first time in her adult life. She's even considering selling the building eventually when she's ready to fully retire, knowing that Roberto has the first option to purchase but will pay fair value. It's not about punishing him, it's about respecting herself enough to expect fair treatment. Emotionally, things remain complex. There are moments when Carmen looks at Roberto and feels the old hurt, remembering the hospital room and the business card and all the times he chose other things over her. There are moments when Roberto feels the old guilt, the weight of everything she's sacrificed, even though he's trying to move past it. They're both carrying scars from years of dysfunction. Healing isn't linear, but they're both committed to the process. The thing that remains unresolved, the ambiguity that hangs over everything, is whether they would have gotten here without the crisis. Would Roberto have changed if Carmen hadn't formalized the business arrangement, hadn't drawn that hard boundary? Would Carmen have found the strength to demand better if her body hadn't physically collapsed, forcing the issue? Both of them suspect the answer is no, that sometimes relationships need to break completely before they can be rebuilt into something healthier, that the pain was necessary, but that knowledge doesn't make it less painful. Carmen still wonders sometimes if she did the right thing, if treating the relationship transactionally, even temporarily, damaged something that can never be fully repaired. If she lost years with her son that they'll never get back. If her pride and hurt pushed him away when patience and forgiveness might have brought him back naturally. These doubts surface late at night, in quiet moments when she's alone. Roberto wonders too, if his mother's demands were fair or manipulative, if the lease arrangement was justice or revenge, if he should have handled things differently from the start, been a better son before things got bad enough to require legal intervention, if the version of their relationship they're building now is real, or if it's constructed on a foundation of financial leverage. He doesn't have answers, just the commitment to keep showing up and hope that eventually it becomes genuine all the way through. What's clear is that their relationship changed fundamentally. The old dynamic, where Carmen gave endlessly and Roberto took while feeling guilty about taking, is gone. What's replaced it is something more balanced, but also more fragile. They both have to choose it actively. Roberto has to choose to prioritize time with his mother. Carmen has to choose to accept his efforts without resentment about the past. It's exhausting sometimes, but it's also more honest than anything they had before. So that's the complete story. Every detail, every complication. A mother who worked herself into the ground for a son who grew distant. A son who couldn't handle the weight of his mother's sacrifice and ran from it. A hospitalization that revealed the depth of disconnection. A business arrangement that forced a reckoning. A slow, difficult attempt to rebuild something real from the wreckage. And two people, both flawed, both hurting, trying to figure out what family means when obligation isn't enough and love alone doesn't fix everything. Now it's your turn to decide. Was Carmen right to formalize the lease agreement, to treat her son like a tenant when he treated her like an obligation? Or did she weaponize money in a way that damaged their relationship beyond repair? Was Roberto's distance a natural response to a mother who made sacrifice into a burden? Or was it a failure of basic filial duty, a betrayal of the woman who gave him everything? Is anyone fully right in this situation? Or is it more complicated than that? A messy human story where both people made mistakes and both people are trying to do better? You've heard everything, no detail left out. So you tell me, who was in the wrong? Was anyone fully right, or is it more complicated than simple blame? The comments are going to be split on this one. Some will say Carmen had every right to protect herself.
Others will say she turned love into a transaction. Some will say Roberto needed that wake-up call. Others will say he was dealing with his own struggles and Carmen made it worse. Think carefully, consider both sides, and remember, family isn't simple. Love isn't simple. Sometimes the person who hurts you is also the person who loves you.
Sometimes protecting yourself means risking the relationship you're trying to save. Before you cast your verdict, let's break down the psychology behind what we just witnessed. Because this isn't just a story about a difficult mother-son relationship. This is a textbook example of toxic family dynamics that millions of people are living through right now without the vocabulary to explain what's happening to them. Let's expose the machinery underneath the drama. You've heard the story, you feel the anger, or the sympathy, or the confusion, but do you know exactly what happened to your brain just now? You experienced a carefully constructed narrative designed to make you question everything you thought you knew about parental sacrifice and filial duty. The story activated your own family patterns, your own experiences with obligation and love, and the terrible space between them. And underneath it all, there was a specific psychological weapon being deployed, not intentionally necessarily, but deployed nonetheless. Let's talk about what I call sacrificial martyrdom as emotional currency. This is the dynamic where one person, usually a parent, makes continuous sacrifices and then uses those sacrifices as leverage in the relationship. It's not conscious manipulation mostly. It's a survival strategy that becomes toxic over time. Here's how the mechanism works. Step 1. The foundational sacrifice. The parent, often in difficult circumstances, makes genuine, necessary sacrifices for the child. In Carmen's case, working brutal hours to provide for Roberto after the divorce. This sacrifice is real. The hardship is real. The love motivating it is real. Nothing about this initial stage is false or manipulative. It's survival. It's doing what you have to do. Step 2. The identity fusion. The parent begins to build their entire identity around the sacrifice. They become the person who sacrificed everything. Their sense of worth, their reason for existing, becomes tied to what they're giving up for the child. Carmen literally was her restaurant, was the work she did for Roberto. When people asked about her life, the answer was always about what she was doing for him. The sacrifice stopped being something she did and became who she was. Step 3. The unspoken contract. Here's where it gets psychologically complex. The parent begins to unconsciously expect that the sacrifice will be repaid with loyalty, gratitude, and devotion. They don't usually say this explicitly, but there's an internal ledger running, keeping track of everything given, expecting eventually it will be balanced with love. Carmen expected that raising Roberto alone, funding his education, enabling his success, would guarantee his presence in her life. That he'd remember, that he'd be grateful enough to prioritize her. Step 4. The debt that can't be paid. The child grows up aware of the sacrifice, feeling the weight of it, understanding on some level that they can never fully repay what was given. How do you repay a childhood? How do you repay a mother working 16-hour days? You can't. The debt is unpayable, and unpayable debt becomes suffocating. Roberto felt this his entire life, the knowledge that he cost his mother everything, that her suffering was for him. That kind of guilt doesn't create gratitude. It creates distance. Step 5. The distance sacrifice spiral. The child pulls away to escape the weight of unpayable debt. The parent, feeling abandoned after everything they gave, sacrifices more, trying to earn back the connection. The child feels even more guilty and pulls away further. The cycle intensifies. Each person's actions make perfect sense from their own perspective. Carmen worked harder because she thought providing more would make Roberto appreciate her. Roberto distanced himself more because her increased sacrifice made him feel even worse about not being able to reciprocate. Most people miss the key insight here. This isn't about a selfish son or a manipulative mother. This is about a psychological trap that both people fell into, each responding rationally to impossible circumstances, each making things worse while trying to make them better. Carmen wasn't wrong to sacrifice for her son. Roberto wasn't wrong to need space from overwhelming guilt, but the dynamic they created together became toxic. Remember when Carmen said in the hospital that everything she did was for Roberto? That moment right there. Go back in your mind to that conversation. Roberto's response wasn't gratitude, it was defensiveness. I never asked you to sacrifice your whole life for me. Most people heard that and thought, what an ungrateful brat. But look deeper. What he was actually saying was, you made me responsible for your suffering and I can't carry that weight. Both statements are true. She did sacrifice for him. He didn't ask for it in a way that created obligation. These truths don't contradict. They coexist in the terrible complexity of family love. The mechanism of sacrificial martyrdom as emotional currency operates on a fundamental misunderstanding of how human relationships work. We think sacrifice creates love. Sometimes it does. But sometimes it creates debt. And debt creates resentment, not connection. Carmen gave from a place of love, but the giving became a weight that crushed what it was meant to nurture. She wasn't wrong to give, but the expectation that giving would guarantee receiving, that was the trap. You can't purchase love with suffering. You can't earn devotion through martyrdom. But our culture, especially certain family cultures, teaches us that you can, that a mother's sacrifice automatically creates a son's obligation. It doesn't, it creates a mess. Now let's look at the reactive concept. What happened to Carmen psychologically as a result of this dynamic? This is called codependent sacrifice syndrome. It's when your sense of worth becomes entirely dependent on what you're doing for someone else, when you can't imagine yourself as valuable outside of your usefulness to another person. Carmen couldn't retire, couldn't hire help, couldn't slow down, not just because of money, but because stopping would mean facing the question, who am I when I'm not sacrificing for my son? The biological reality here matters. When you're in a codependent dynamic like this, your brain gets addicted to the role. There's a dopamine hit to being needed, to being the indispensable one, to suffering in a way that feels meaningful. Carmen's brain had been flooded with those chemicals for 40 years. Every long shift, every missed moment of rest, every time she pushed through exhaustion, her brain released chemicals that said, this matters, you matter, your suffering has purpose. Stopping felt like death because neurologically, she'd wired her brain to only feel valuable when she was in pain for someone else. This is why she couldn't walk away earlier. It's why the distance from Roberto hurts so much. She'd built her entire neurological reward system around being his mother, specifically being his self-sacrificing mother. When he didn't need her anymore, or didn't seem to need her, it wasn't just emotionally painful. It was a neurological crisis. Her brain's primary source of meaning and reward had been cut off. Let's do a scene breakdown of the most frustrating moment in the story. The hospital visit. 7 minutes. Most of you watching were screaming, "Don't accept this, demand better, kick him out." But Carmen couldn't. Here's why, using this framework. When Roberto showed up with cheap flowers and expensive coffee, Carmen's brain did something predictable. It grabbed onto that scrap of attention like a lifeline. See? He came. He cares. Look, he brought flowers. Her codependent wiring was desperate to reframe any minimal effort as proof of love, because accepting the truth that 7 minutes was an insult would mean facing the reality that her sacrifice hadn't worked, that 40 years of suffering hadn't purchased his devotion. That's too painful to accept all at once. So her brain did what codependent brains do. It made excuses. He's busy. His job is demanding. He came, that's what matters. This wasn't weakness. This was brain chemistry. When you've organized your entire identity around being needed by someone, you'll accept crumbs and call it a feast, because the alternative is admitting that you've built your life on a foundation that doesn't exist, that you've been feeding coins into a machine that will never pay out. The moment Carmen started to break free was when she felt that crack inside her chest after the doctor told her Roberto had prioritized a client dinner. That was the sound of the codependent framework shattering, the moment when the brain can't make excuses anymore, can't reframe the neglect as anything but neglect. That's when change becomes possible. But it's also when the pain becomes unbearable, because you're not just losing the relationship, you're losing your entire sense of who you are. The synthesis here is crucial. When you combine sacrificial martyrdom as emotional currency with codependent sacrifice syndrome, you don't get a relationship. You get a hostage situation. Carmen was holding herself hostage to Roberto's approval, to his gratitude, to his love. And Roberto was being held hostage by guilt, by unpayable debt, by the weight of being someone's entire reason for existing. Neither person could breathe. Neither person could be authentic. They were locked in a dance where every step made sense individually, but the pattern was destroying them both. This is the part where I need you to understand something important. If you've ever felt this confusion in your own life, if you've ever sacrificed endlessly for someone and felt hurt when they didn't appreciate it the way you wanted, if you've ever felt suffocated by someone's love and guilty for feeling suffocated, you're not broken. You're caught in a pattern, and patterns can be changed. But first you have to see them. First you have to name them. Sacrificial martyrdom as emotional currency, codependent sacrifice syndrome. These aren't just academic terms. They're the invisible machinery running underneath relationships that feel simultaneously full of love and completely dysfunctional. Carmen's decision to formalize the lease wasn't really about money. It was about breaking the pattern. It was her brain finally saying, I can't keep doing this. I can't keep giving everything and getting nothing. I can't keep organizing my entire existence around someone who doesn't prioritize me. The legal documents were a way of forcing Roberto to see her, to acknowledge her, to treat her as someone with power and agency instead of just an endless source of supply. It was radical. It was probably necessary. But it was also painful as hell, because it meant admitting that love alone hadn't been enough. That sacrifice alone hadn't been enough. That she'd been playing a game that couldn't be won. I bet you didn't catch this detail in the first part of the story. Go back mentally to point 2, when Carmen described Roberto's prep school years. She mentioned how he stopped inviting friends over, how he'd tense when she hugged him at the train station. That wasn't just teenage embarrassment. That was step 1 of the debt that can't be paid. He was already pulling away, already feeling the weight of what she'd given up for him, already understanding that he could never be enough to justify her suffering. The red flag was there when he was 16. The distance started long before the hospital. Or look at the moment when Roberto suggested Carmen sell the restaurant to fund his law school. Most people heard that as entitled and selfish. But through this psychological lens, it was actually tragic. He was trying to end the cycle. He was essentially saying, let me pay off the debt now, let me take this burden and handle it, so we can stop this pattern. He didn't have the emotional vocabulary to explain it that way. It came out as a suggestion to sell her life's work. But what he was really trying to do was say, please stop sacrificing. Please let me take care of this. Let's change the dynamic. Carmen refused because the restaurant was her identity, and the cycle continued for another decade. These are the clues the audience missed. The pattern was visible the whole time. Every moment of distance was Roberto trying to escape unpayable debt. Every moment of increased sacrifice was Carmen trying to earn love through suffering. They were both trapped, both fighting to break free, both making it worse. And neither of them had the tools to see what was happening until it all collapsed. So when you're sitting there in judgment, deciding who's right and who's wrong, I want you to hold this complexity. Carmen wasn't wrong to want her son's love. Roberto wasn't wrong to need distance from suffocating guilt. Carmen was right to set boundaries. Roberto was right to challenge the expectation that sacrifice creates obligation. They were both right. They were both wrong. They were both human beings trying to navigate an impossible dynamic that our culture sets up and then blames individuals for struggling with. The question isn't really who's wrong. The question is, how do you love someone without making that love into a cage? How do you sacrifice for someone without making that sacrifice into a weapon? How do you honor what you've been given without being crushed by the weight of unpayable debt? These are questions our culture doesn't give us good answers for. So people like Carmen and Roberto stumble through doing the best they can, hurting each other while loving each other until something breaks and forces a change. That's the psychological autopsy. That's what was happening underneath the drama. Two people caught in a pattern older than both of them. A pattern our culture creates and maintains. A pattern that destroys relationships while claiming to honor them. And the only way out was to break it completely, to risk everything, to formalize the distance that already existed and see if something real could be built from the wreckage. You have the facts now. You have the psychological framework. You understand the trap they were in. So I'll ask again, who's wrong? And is that even the right question? We usually only see red flags in the rearview mirror, don't we? We look back at relationships that fell apart and say, oh, that's where it started. That's when I should have known. But what if we could recognize these patterns in real time? What if we could see the warning signs before they become disasters? Let's change that. Let's identify the specific flags that predict exactly this kind of family breakdown. If you see these 5 signs, the ending is almost mathematically guaranteed, and I want you to have the tools to spot them. Red flag number 1, love expressed exclusively through provision. This is the subtle beginning, the thing that looks romantic and devoted at first, but isn't. Watch for the parent who never says I love you, but always says I'm working for you, or I'm doing this for you. Watch for the child whose only interaction with a parent is receiving things, money or support or help, without emotional connection underneath it. Carmen and Roberto's early relationship looked like this. She showed love through endless work. He received the benefits of that work, but they didn't talk. They didn't share emotional intimacy. They didn't build connection outside of the provision-reception dynamic. The reveal here is that provision isn't the same as love. It can be an expression of love, but if it's the only expression, you're building a transactional relationship disguised as a familial one. Carmen thought working 70-hour weeks was how you showed love. Roberto received the benefits and felt grateful, but not connected. There was no emotional vocabulary between them, no way to express or receive love outside of money and sacrifice. The test to distinguish healthy provision from this red flag: ask yourself, if the provision stopped tomorrow, would the relationship survive? If a parent couldn't work anymore, couldn't give financially anymore, would the child still want to be around them? If the answer is uncertain, you're looking at love as provision, not actual emotional intimacy. The healthy version is provision with connection. Working to support your child while also talking to them, knowing them, building a relationship based on who they are, not just what you can give them. Carmen never learned who Roberto was as a person, separate from being her son, her project, her reason for sacrifice. The action step. If you see this pattern in your own life, either as the provider or the receiver, pause and ask, when was the last time we connected without anything being exchanged? When did we last have a conversation that wasn't about needs or money or logistics? When did I last feel seen by this person as a human being, not just a role? If you can't answer easily, that's your red flag. Start building emotional connection separate from provision. Have conversations, share feelings, see each other. Red flag. Number 2, the boundary violation disguised as sacrifice. This is where things get psychologically dangerous. Watch for the moment when someone crosses a boundary, their own or someone else's, and frames it as noble sacrifice. When Carmen kept working despite exhaustion, despite health warnings, despite her body literally shutting down, that wasn't dedication, that was boundary violation. She was violating her own physical limits and calling it love. When Roberto's prep school friend's family questioned Carmen too intensely, making the girlfriend uncomfortable, and Carmen defended it as just caring, that was violating social boundaries and framing it as maternal concern. The technique used to crush the boundary is reframing, taking a violation and making it sound like virtue. I'm just worried about you, when you're actually being controlling. I just want the best for you, when you're actually ignoring what they've said they want. I'm doing this for you, when actually you're doing it to manage your own anxiety or need for control. Carmen violated her own boundaries constantly, destroying her health in the name of providing for Roberto. He never asked her to. But once she'd done it, she could frame his distance as ingratitude, making him responsible for boundaries he didn't ask her to cross. This flag is the best predictor of future dysfunction because it establishes that boundaries don't matter when love is the justification. If someone will violate their own boundaries for you, they'll eventually expect you to violate yours for them. If someone pushes past your no and calls it caring, they're teaching you that your autonomy matters less than their need to give or control or help. The counter move when someone does this to you, name it clearly. I appreciate your concern, but I've already said no. I understand you want to help, but I need you to respect my decision. Your sacrifice doesn't obligate me to accept it. Be direct, be firm. People who genuinely love you will respect boundaries. People who are using love as a control mechanism will escalate when you set limits. That escalation tells you everything you need to know. Red flag number 3. The reality distortion through guilt assignment. This is more subtle, but incredibly damaging. Watch for the person who makes you feel guilty for existing, for costing them, for being a burden, even when they claim they don't mind. Roberto grew up feeling guilty for every dollar Carmen spent on him, every hour she worked, every sacrifice she made. She didn't explicitly say, "You owe me," but the message was clear in every exhausted sigh, every mention of how hard she was working, every time she said no to something for herself because she was saving for his future. The crazy-making factor here is that the guilt isn't based on anything you did wrong. You didn't ask to be born, you didn't demand excessive sacrifice, but somehow You feel responsible for someone else's suffering. That's reality distortion. That's someone making their choices about how to live their life into your fault, your debt, your responsibility. Carmen chose to work brutal hours. Roberto was a child. He had no say in that choice, but he carried the guilt of it his entire life. This flag makes victims doubt their own sanity because the person inducing guilt often genuinely believes they're not doing it. Carmen would have been shocked to hear that Roberto felt guilty. She thought she was just being a good mother. But the emotional reality she created, the weight of her visible suffering, communicated a very different message than her words. The subtext was always,
Look what I'm giving up for you. Look what you cost me. Be grateful. The damage compounds because you can't address it directly. If Roberto had said, you make me feel guilty, Carmen would have been hurt and defensive. I never said you owe me anything. I'm just working hard for you. Both statements true, both missing the point. The guilt isn't about what's said.
It's about the emotional temperature of the relationship, the unspoken ledger always running in the background. The way to protect yourself: separate people's choices from your responsibility. If someone chooses to sacrifice for you, that's their choice. It doesn't create automatic debt. You can appreciate it without being crushed by it. Practice saying thank you without adding I'm sorry or I owe you. Notice when you're carrying guilt for things you didn't choose and couldn't control. A parent's decision to work hard, to go without, to struggle, those are their decisions. You can honor them without being destroyed by them. Carmen's sacrifices were real. Roberto's guilt was also real. But the guilt shouldn't have existed because the sacrifices were supposed to be motivated by love, not debt creation. Red flag number 4, isolation through shame or loyalty demands. Look for the pattern where connection with the parent requires disconnection from everyone else, where loving them means accepting their worldview completely, where any outside perspective is treated as betrayal. Carmen didn't do this overtly, but there was an element of it. When Roberto brought his girlfriend home and Carmen's intensity made her uncomfortable, Roberto felt torn between his mother and his girlfriend. When friends questioned whether he should visit Carmen more, he felt defensive and guilty. There was an implicit demand: I've sacrificed everything for you. The least you can do is prioritize me above everyone else. The rhetoric used here is often us against the world framing. The family as a fortress. Outsiders don't understand. Other people will let you down, but family never will. This sounds protective and loving. Sometimes it is. But sometimes it's isolation. Sometimes it's cutting off access to perspectives that might challenge the dynamic. To support that might help you see the dysfunction. Roberto's isolation was subtle. He had friends, relationships, a life. But he couldn't bring people into his family world because it was too complicated, too heavy, too full of unspoken guilt and obligation. The worlds stayed separate. Carmen stayed in her restaurant, her neighborhood, her role as the self-sacrificing mother. Roberto built his life elsewhere, where he could breathe. That separation was necessary for his survival, but it also meant no one could see the full picture. No one could intervene. No one could say, this dynamic is hurting both of you. The counter is building and maintaining connections outside the dysfunctional relationship. Having friends who know the full truth. Having family members who can offer perspective. Going to therapy. Reading about family dynamics. Getting the vocabulary to name what's happening. Isolation keeps dysfunction invisible. Connection brings it into the light where it can be addressed. Red flag number 5. The deadly escalation. Love measured in crisis response. This is the final warning before complete breakdown. Watch for the relationship where connection only happens during emergencies. where the only time someone shows up is when there's a crisis, where love is measured not by consistent presence, but by dramatic rescue. Roberto's pattern with Carmen was exactly this. Years of distance interrupted by occasional moments when she really needed something and he'd show up, feel like a good son for helping, then disappear again into his separate life. The point of no return is when crisis becomes the only currency of connection. When you realize that the only time this person prioritizes you is when you're literally falling apart. When being okay means being ignored, being in trouble means being seen. This creates a perverse incentive structure. Dysfunction becomes the price of attention. You can't just need someone, you have to be in crisis to justify their presence. Carmen's collapse was the ultimate version of this pattern. Years of Roberto not showing up, not visiting, not prioritizing. But when she collapsed and was hospitalized, that should have triggered his presence. It didn't, not really, not enough. And that told Carmen everything. Even crisis wasn't enough to make him choose her. That's when you know the relationship is fundamentally broken, when even your worst moment doesn't warrant their time, when even genuine need gets triaged below business obligations. You're not dealing with connection anymore. You're dealing with someone who's already left. They just haven't made it official. The evidence list is complete. 5 red flags that, when they appear together, predict family breakdown with brutal accuracy. Love expressed only through provision. Boundary violations disguised as sacrifice. Reality distortion through guilt assignment. Isolation through shame or loyalty demands. Love measured only in crisis response. If you see all 5, the relationship is already dying. The only question is whether anyone will acknowledge it in time to do something about it. Here's what Carmen's story teaches us. You can love someone completely and still be in a toxic dynamic with them. You can sacrifice everything and still lose the relationship. You can do all the right things according to cultural scripts and end up in exactly the wrong place. Because the scripts are broken. The model of family that says parental sacrifice automatically creates filial devotion, that model doesn't work. It creates guilt and distance and resentment dressed up as love. The pattern recognition skill you need, learn to see the difference between love and transaction. Love is, I want you to thrive, even if that takes you away from me. Transaction is, I'm giving you this, so you owe me that. Love accepts boundaries, transaction violates them. Love allows independence. Transaction demands loyalty. Love celebrates your growth. Transaction resents it because growth means you need them less. Carmen and Roberto were locked in transaction disguised as love. She transacted her labor for his success and expected his devotion in return. He accepted the transaction but resented the debt it created. Neither person was wrong. Both people were trapped. And the only way out was to acknowledge the transaction explicitly, make it real and legal and clear so they could build something separate from it. The lease agreement wasn't the end of their relationship. It was the beginning of honesty. It was saying, this part is business. Now let's see if we can build a part that's actually love, without obligation, without debt, without the weight of unpayable sacrifice. So now, with all this context, with the psychological framework and the red flags and the understanding of the trap they were both in, I'm going to ask you one more time. Was Carmen right to formalize the lease? Was it justice or manipulation? Was it protecting herself or weaponizing money? Was Roberto wrong to prioritize his career over his hospitalized mother? Was it callous neglect or a desperate attempt to maintain boundaries with someone whose love felt like drowning? You have the facts, the story in full detail. You have the motive, the psychological machinery operating underneath. You have the evidence, the 5 red flags that predicted exactly this outcome. Now you must decide, is this a tragedy of two people who loved each other but couldn't figure out how to do it without destroying each other? Is this a story of justified boundaries and necessary consequences? Is this manipulation and ungrateful abandonment? Is this all of the above?
Existing in the terrible complexity of real human relationships that don't fit into neat moral categories. I am handing the gavel to you. The court is adjourned. See you in the comments.